Hello and welcome to an introduction to sociology for A-level. What we're going to do in this lesson is introduce some of the key concepts within sociology, a number of the key thinkers, really ask what sociology is before we outline a number of different subjects we're going to be talking about within the realm of sociology. So, as an introduction, sociology can be described as the study of human society, the ways in which humans interact with each other, not just the organization of human society, but also the development of human society, the functions of human society, etc., etc. And since this is such a broad definition of sociology, we can then find that it's actually quite extensive. There's a lot of things that we study when we're talking about sociology. So, for example, in this set of series of videos, we're going to talk about education. We're going to talk about things like class. We're going to talk about things like gender and sexuality. Gender plus sexuality. We're going to talk about things like crime and deviance. And we're going to talk about more international, global issues like globalization. These are just some of the things that we're going to talk about in this series of lessons. But these all fall under the concepts of sociology. We can also talk about economic sociology, political sociology. All of these are quite vast, and really this is why it's difficult to always find a pertinent and concrete definition of sociology. What we can do, though, is look at some of the main founding fathers of sociology, founding principles, the founding people who wrote extensively around the concepts of sociology. The first of them being the philosopher, economist Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx, as we know, is somebody who was a critic of capitalism. So a critic of capitalism. He didn't just talk about the economic impact of capitalism and the way in which capitalism worked, but he also talked about a number of sociological theories. Talk about things like capitalistic ideology and the lens in which we all view society through. He talked about the ways in which capitalism impacts the labour market, the labour forces, and the ways in which the fact that because the workers do not own the means of production, they are what we would describe as alienated from their labour. There is a certain amount of alienation that exists. Some of the things that Karl Marx discussed in his theories of capitalism. Emil Durkheim, on the other hand, was somebody who developed a number of key functionalist ideas. So he just talked about things like functionalism, the ways in which and the functions that society plays a part in. So for example, when we are looking at a functional sociological analysis of education, we'd be talking about what the functions and purposes of education are. And there are a number of other obviously important aspects of functionalism which we will get into in actually the next lesson. And you've got philosophers and sociologists like Max Weber. Now, Max Weber would come out with a number of different ways in which social institutions interconnect. So the interconnection of social institutions. Now, these aren't the only things that these sociologists have developed and understood. We will be talking about their contributions to each different aspect of sociology as we go on through the lessons more and more detail. And we will also talk about them in their own separate video just to get an idea of what functionalism is and what Marxist critiques are and what Max Weber would talk about. But these are described as the founding fathers of modern sociological theory. Let me just move this back to that. There we go. Before we finish, I want to talk about a number of different principles of sociology. So there are a number of main themes within the study of sociology. These themes seem to they seem to be extended beyond all the different subjects of sociology. So when we talk about education, when we talk about sexuality and gender, we have to talk about things like culture and socialization as well. And so these things, they almost go beyond the individual subjects and sort of permeate sociology, entirely. So let's beginning by talking about culture. Culture is a difficult thing to define in a specific way. So culture indicates a number of characteristics within a particular group. Now these include things like their way of life, a particular language, religion, values, and knowledge, for example. This is a non-exhaustive list as well. So culture tends to be quite a non-exhaustive list of different things that we can use to identify different groups. The problem with culture is it is a nearly infinitely complex web of different aspects and attributes. So, for example, if we were just to define culture as way of life, of a group, well, that's a number of things we can talk about. There are a number of little things and traditions and language and belief systems that we can actually identify and pick apart when we talk about culture. Culture also changes depending on both geography and time period. So, for example, British culture is different to French culture. French versus British culture. Equally, British culture today is different to British culture from the 1800s. So the time period is also a determining factor. So we're not just talking about space in terms of whereabouts we're looking when we talk about culture. We're also talking about time. Socialization is the second aspect. And this is a little bit an extension of the study of culture. And what socialization does is it tells us how to study how a culture is passed on from generation to generation. So it's a study of how people begin to adapt their culture through a number of means. This can be familial practice, this can be things like education, it can be the particular media where they are, it could be their workplace, their social peers. It can also include things like their religion. It can also include things like various celebrities. It can also include, social institutions. It can include things like government. And that doesn't necessarily mean government enforcing culture, but just that government can, and the way in which the kind of system of government that you live in can have an impact on the kind of culture that exists in the society in which you live. And that's what socialization is about. It's how we socialize individuals, how people become socialized, how people become adaptive to the particular cultures that they live in and exist in. The most difficult thing to define is the concept of identity within sociology. Now, identity can be described in a number of different ways. One way we can describe it is just by a list of your characteristics. So, for example, the identity of an individual can include their gender, it could include their age, it could include their appearance, it could include race and ethnicity. If we go over here, we can go to race plus ethnicity. It can include a number of things. But it can also be influenced by other factors. So one way in which sociologists like to study the concept of identity is not necessarily by studying what particular identities individuals have, but study how identity can be influenced through social factors. So basically a determination relating to the ways in which you perceive yourself. So how you are perceived and how your characteristics, how your identity informs that perception. So, for example, if we can have factors like class. Now, your position within society, your class, might have an impact on your identity and how you define and how you perceive yourself. The same goes for ethnicity, sexuality, and also gender. The final two concepts I want to talk about in this lesson, as just an introduction to a number of key principles, is the concepts of social differentiation and stratification. Now, these two are interconnected, so that's why I thought I'd put it in its own separate piece here. So, when we're talking about social differentiation and stratification, there are two things that need to be discussed when it comes to sociology. So we have social differentiation. What this refers to is the ways in which society is divided up. Now, we know that in society we have a number of divisions. There are a number of ways in which, not necessarily forced upon, we not necessarily have divisions that are forced upon members of society, but just ways in which groups tend to coalesce within society. So groups tend to divide themselves and coalesce on the basis of class, in a lot of cases, on the basis of sexuality, on the basis of ethnicity, and also on things, the basis of language is a very good barrier as well. Language is a good barrier, seeing as that actually can provide a physical barrier to social environments. If you speak a different language to the people around you in a particular social group, then you'll struggle to assimilate into that group in ways in which you might if you were speaking the same language. Social stratification is the second theory that we could talk about, and this also acknowledges that there exists a society that can be divided into different groups. So it also accepts that society is coalesced into different groups, but it looks more not at the ways in which it specifically divides into groups, but it looks at the ways in which society is organized hierarchically. So the sort of vertical division within groups, to the point in which we have people who are higher up in society and people who are lower down in society. And this vertical division can be on a number of different bases. We can be on the basis of status. It could be on the basis of wealth. If you're a Marxist, if you want to look at a Marxist analysis of social stratification, you would talk about the basis of class and the way class division and class antagonism determines the sort of stratification, the hierarchical structure of different groups. But it can also be other factors like sex and gender. The ways in which people are viewed in society can also depend on their sex and their gender. So, for example, historically, women were seen as lower class citizens and were seen as not being worthy of being up in the upper class compared to men. Now, this is something that thankfully has changed and is continuing to change and requires more change, of course, but is something that is changing quicker and quicker. And so that's the concepts of differentiation and stratification. Differentiation talks broadly about the ways in which society is divided, the ways in which we can look at the different groupings within society. Stratification also looks at divisions within society, but looks at vertical divisions within society, looks at the hierarchical structure. So if we're looking at class, for example, you might have a structure like so, where we have an upper class, we can have a middle class down here, middle class down here, oopsie daisy, and then at the bottom we can have lower classes. So we have the lower class, and this is actually quite, colloquially, is a way that people tend to discuss things. People tend to talk about things like the middle class. People tend not to talk about things like lower classes, but as somewhere within this range here, between middle and lower, we tend to have things like the working class. Working class. This is also a concept that is almost Marxist in nature, considering that we're talking about the division between the owners and the workers, and the ways in which those two classes of individuals relate to each other. In the next few lessons, we're going to do a number of lessons on specific sociological theories. So we'll talk about what a Marxist tends to view, how they tend to view society. We'll talk about how functionalism works within society, and then we'll talk about other theories of sociology, things like feminist theories and the new right theory of sociology. Then after that, we'll start to get into individual subjects within sociology. We'll talk about education, talk about things like crime and deviance, the impact of religion within society, impact of the media within society, and other things as well, things like sex and gender, and all of these different theories within sociology.